At first, it felt like a dream: silks, jewels, secret glances across candle-lit halls. To be the king's chosen mistress was to have the ear of the most powerful man in the realm. But dreams in a royal court can turn to nightmares overnight. Behind the gifts came the gossip. Behind the doors came the demands. And when a mistress learned too much or simply stopped pleasing him, her fall was fast, public, and brutal. Because in the Middle Ages, the crown could lift you higher than you ever imagined, and drop you where no one would dare catch you. The first thing a royal mistress discovered too late was that her power wasn't hers at all. It was borrowed, lent to her by a man who could take it back with a single look. At first, it felt intoxicating. Every glance from the king was a spark, every gift a promise. Courtiers bowed, ladies curtsied, servants rushed to open her doors. She was closer to the throne than the queen herself, and she believed it meant safety. But in the court's shadows, knives were already out. Queens might have tolerated her, but others wanted her gone. Jealous rivals, ambitious courtiers, and bitter ladies-in-waiting all watched for a crack in her smile, a slip in her tone, because one whisper could ruin her faster than a scandal could save her. The palace played its own games. A jeweled necklace wasn't always a gift, sometimes it was payment for betrayal. A gown wasn't always a token of affection, sometimes it carried poisoned perfume, a slow sickness that dimmed her beauty. Nothing in the palace was ever just what it seemed. And when the king's gaze began to drift, she learned the most dangerous truth of all. There is no graceful way down from the height he put you on. Some were married off to strangers in distant lands. Others were sent to convents, stripped of silk for plain linen. And some simply vanished. The worst part? It all happened while she was still smiling, still believing she was untouchable. Because the deadliest trap for a royal mistress wasn't the fall. It was not seeing the ground rushing up to meet her. And sometimes that ground was made of secrets. Secrets she could never repeat. If being a royal mistress came with luxury, it also came with a vault full of secrets, and the key was welded shut. Some secrets were intoxicating. Which foreign envoy had insulted the king? Which lord was plotting against the crown? Which noble owed so much gold he'd sell his own title to pay it back? She knew the whispers before they became decrees. But the most dangerous secrets weren't about politics. They were about the king himself, his tempers, his weaknesses, the names he muttered in the dark, the letters he kept hidden in drawers no one else dared open. To know these things was to hold a blade you could never use, because the moment you tried, it would turn on you. Royal mistresses often became keepers of the king's sins. If he ordered an execution in secret, she knew. If he broke a treaty under the table, she heard. And that meant she wasn't just his companion, she was his accomplice. That power was an illusion. A mistress who knew too much could never simply walk away. If she left willingly, she might still vanish before dawn. Her body found in a garden or not at all. If she stayed, she risked becoming the king's hostage in all but name, kept close, watched closely, trusted only as far as she feared him. One story tells of a mistress who discovered the king had been poisoning his own brother. She thought she could use it to secure her position forever. Instead, she was found asleep at her dressing table, a goblet of wine beside her. The official cause a fever of the blood. In court, secrets were more lethal than swords, because a sword could kill you quickly, but a secret could hang over your head for years, cutting a little deeper each day. And the cruelest truth? Some secrets were planted on the mistress on purpose. A forged letter slipped into her desk, a jewel stolen from the treasury and hidden in her chambers. When the king decided she had outlived her use, those secrets became her crimes. That's when she learned the second rule of survival. It's not the truth that destroys you. It's the story they choose to tell about it. And sometimes, the story began not in the throne room, but in the queen's chambers. The queen didn't need a sword to destroy a mistress. She had something sharper, the court itself. On the surface, the queen was untouchable, chosen for politics, blessed by the church, draped in the untouchable sanctity of the crown. But did that mean she couldn't fight? No. It meant she could fight without ever getting her hands dirty. A royal mistress might think her real enemy was the king's fading attention, But what if the true danger was the woman across the banquet table, smiling as if nothing was wrong? The queen's attacks rarely came in daylight. Why strike openly when you can destroy someone piece by piece and make her thank you for it? It started subtly. A feast where the mistress found her seat suddenly 2 places further from the king. A dance where the queen accidentally stepped between them. Small humiliations that everyone noticed, except the king. Allies disappeared. Why did her most loyal lady-in-waiting suddenly get reassigned? Why did the servant who knew her best vanish overnight? Every change made her a little more alone. In a palace, isolation was the first cut. The queen's greatest weapon? Patience. She knew infatuation had an expiration date. Why rush when time could do half the work for you? A single well-placed rumor could speed the clock. A whisper about the mistress's growing arrogance. A joke about her influence over royal decisions. What king likes to think he's being manipulated? Some queens played dirtier. One replaced the mistress's perfume with a mixture laced with crushed lead glass, beautiful scent, burning skin. Another had the royal painter subtly age the mistress's portrait before presenting it to the king. What better way to plant the idea that she was fading? And then came the staged discoveries. Why did the queen keep finding the mistress's belongings in the king's chambers? Why were there gold trinkets left on his bed? Things she had gifted the mistress weeks earlier. The king might not believe every accident, but doubt doesn't have to be proven. It only has to linger. Sometimes, the queen didn't even act alone. What if the king was letting it happen? What if this quiet war was his way of keeping the mistress desperate, clinging to him for safety? Too distracted to plot. In court, affection and cruelty could look exactly the same. The cruelest tactic of all? Friendship. The queen inviting the mistress to walk in her private gardens, complimenting her gowns, promising to shield her from gossip. Why would she suspect a knife was hidden behind the embrace? Because in the end, the queen didn't need to kill her rival. She just had to ruin her. A ruined mistress posed no threat to the throne. A ruined mistress could be erased from history without anyone mourning her. In the medieval court, being forgotten was worse than being dead. And yet, some mistresses didn't crumble. What happens when the prey stops running? What happens when she turns, teeth bared, ready to use the same weapons against the queen? That's when the palace stopped being a stage and became a battlefield. Some mistresses broke. Others broke the rules. When the queen's shadow loomed too long, when the whispers became daggers, some mistresses decided to stop playing the victim. Because why wait to be destroyed when you can strike first? The first move was always silence. Why let the queen know you'd noticed her war? Why give her the satisfaction of seeing you flinch? Instead, the mistress smiled wider, laughed louder, let the court believe she was untouched. But behind that mask, the trap was already being built. Step 1. Take back allies. A dismissed servant bribed to return with information. A lady-in-waiting lured away from the queen's circle with gifts she couldn't resist. Every courtier had a price, the trick was finding it. Step 2. Control the king's mood. If the queen planted doubt, the mistress planted loyalty. She became the keeper of his peace. She fed his ego, soothed his tempers, reminded him that only she truly understood him. And when the king believed that, every rumor the queen spread began to taste like jealousy. Step 3. Create distractions. Why not give the queen a scandal of her own to manage? A letter forged to suggest the queen favored a certain noble too much. A misplaced piece of jewelry found in another man's chambers. Even if it wasn't true, the court loved nothing more than a whispered, "What if?" Some mistresses played even dirtier. What if the queen's own allies began to suspect her? What if her most trusted attendants started reporting to the mistress instead? Secrets meant leverage, and leverage meant survival. But the boldest weapon was public humiliation. One banquet, one calculated moment, one blow from which the queen could never recover. There's a story of a mistress who staged a gift for the queen, a rare, jeweled mirror said to reveal one's true nature. When the queen looked into it, she found not her own reflection, but a hidden engraving inside the frame. one that quoted her private letters to another man. The hall went silent. The king's face turned to stone. The queen left the feast and didn't return for weeks. And yet, winning against the queen came with its own dangers. What happens when the king starts to fear you as much as he desires you? What happens when he realizes you can ruin him too? Because the closer a mistress came to victory, the more dangerous her position became. She was no longer just a favorite, she was a liability. And kings in the Middle Ages didn't tolerate liabilities for long. One mistress who outmaneuvered a queen found herself suddenly offered a marriage to a distant duke. It was framed as an honor, a reward for her service. In truth, it was exile, gilded, sealed, and inescapable. Another simply vanished after her victory, her apartments emptied overnight, her belongings burned in the palace courtyard. The message was clear: even if you win the game, the king still owns the board. Some, however, learn to survive by becoming untouchable. Not through beauty, not through charm, but through knowledge. A mistress who knew the right secrets, the kind that could topple a throne, was too dangerous to destroy. She could be pushed aside, but not erased. In that way, survival became its own kind of power. And this was the paradox royal mistresses discovered too late. To win was to risk everything. To lose was to be erased. And to endure was to live in the shadows forever. The most cunning of them learned to play both sides. Smile for the queen, whisper to the king, and make sure neither could live without her. It was a dance on the edge of a blade, and the longer you stayed on it, the sharper it became. Because the war between queen and mistress never truly ended. It only shifted, moved, changed its mask. Sometimes the blows were hidden in laughter. Sometimes they were written in blood, and every mistress knew that one day the mask would slip. And when it did, the palace would choose a side. At first, being the king's mistress felt like a crown of its own. Silk sheets, whispered promises, power that could bend a room with a glance. But in the medieval court, love was never just love, it was a contract written in invisible ink. And when the king decided it was over, the fine print came due. Some mistresses were banished, some were stripped of titles, some were buried without ever leaving the palace. Because once you've shared the king's bed, you've seen too much, heard too much, and become too dangerous to simply walk away. And that's when the real punishment began. Punishment in the medieval court didn't always come with a public trial. For royal mistresses, it often arrived quietly, a whisper in the hallway, a sudden summons to the king's private chambers, a carriage waiting in the courtyard with no destination given. By the time they realized it was exile, it was already too late. Some punishments were designed to humiliate. A mistress once adored in silks might be sent away in plain wool, her jewels seized for the crown. Another might find her name scraped from court records, her portraits burned, her memory erased as if she had never existed, because in the eyes of the court, being forgotten was the cruelest fate of all. But some kings preferred their punishments more inventive. One king sent his former mistress to a remote convent, not for penance, but to bury her under vows she could never escape. The abbess, loyal to the crown, ensured her every letter was censored, her visitors turned away. In a world where reputation was everything, she became a ghost long before her death. Others met harsher ends. A mistress, accused of treason, might find herself locked in a tower, awaiting charges that were never read aloud. Another might suffer accidental poisoning at a feast, a single tainted cup of wine that left her slumped over the table as the musicians kept playing, because in the medieval court, even death could be staged as a performance. Sometimes the punishment was not about removing the mistress, but about breaking her. A king might arrange for her to marry a cruel, impoverished noble far from the capital. Her new life would be filled with hardship, isolation, and the slow erosion of the beauty and spirit that once made her valuable. It was a living sentence, and there was no appeal. And yet, the most chilling punishments weren't physical at all. They were the ones that turned the mistress into her own jailer. Forced to live among people who despised her, forbidden from speaking the king's name, knowing that any wrong word could bring an executioner to her door, every breath became a negotiation for survival. For some, The fear never ended. Even in exile, they were watched. Letters intercepted. Servants bribed to report every visitor. Years later, a sudden knock on the door could still bring soldiers because the king had remembered her name and decided she was still a danger. And yet, there were whispers of those who survived, who found a way to reclaim some measure of power from the shadows. They didn't try to return to court. Instead, they turned their knowledge into currency secrets, sold to rival kingdoms, stories traded for protection, truths turned into weapons. Because in the game of survival, a disgraced mistress had one advantage. She had nothing left to lose. And that's when she became most dangerous. What happens when you strip a woman of everything except her memory? For many disgraced royal mistresses, exile wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because the further they were pushed from the throne, the freer they became to use the only weapon the crown couldn't take away: the secrets they carried. Secrets could topple kingdoms, who the king truly loved, which nobles had betrayed him. What decisions were made in candlelit chambers after too much wine? Information was more valuable than gold and more lethal than any sword. Some mistresses started small. A quiet conversation with a visiting merchant who also served as an informant. A letter smuggled to a rival court. The whispers grew louder, and the king began to hear echoes of his own past in places he didn't expect. But this was a dangerous game. How far could you push without making yourself a target? How much truth could you spill before the crown decided to silence you forever? The answer depended on one thing: leverage. A mistress who had only gossip might be ignored or quietly removed. But one who had proof, one who had letters, documents, tokens of the king's weakness, that was a threat that could never be ignored. Some turned their knowledge into protection. One former mistress negotiated her safety by loaning a foreign king the details of a secret military alliance. Another traded the truth about an heir's questionable legitimacy for land, soldiers, and a new title. They had been thrown out as disgraced women and returned as political players. Revenge came in many forms. Sometimes it was a rumor slipped to the right person, one that would reach the king's ears and keep him awake at night. Sometimes it was the slow ruin of a courtier who had once mocked her. The goal was never to attack openly, but to make sure the king felt her presence like a shadow he couldn't shake. One story tells of a mistress who orchestrated a scandal so perfectly that the king never knew it was her hand guiding it. A forged note, a lost ring, a noble's sudden disgrace. The chain reaction ended with the queen herself being blamed for treachery she never committed. The mistress watched from far away as the court tore itself apart. And yet, revenge was never just about punishment. It was about reclaiming identity. To be banished was to be erased. To strike back was to prove you still existed. But the more a mistress fought to be remembered, the more she risked being destroyed all over again. Because kings feared nothing more than a ghost from their past rising to speak. What if she told the world what he whispered in the dark? What if she revealed the truth about the wars he started, the oaths he broke, the blood on his hands? Some didn't live long enough to find out. A sudden illness, a hunting accident, a fall from a balcony no one had seen coming. The crown had many ways to silence a voice that spoke too much truth. But for those who survived, they became legends. Women whispered about in taverns, names recorded in secret letters, cautionary tales for the next mistress who thought she could survive the crown's love. And if those whispers were sometimes exaggerated, if the stories grew darker and grander with each telling, that only made them more powerful, because the truth didn't matter as much as the fear it created. And a king who feared you even in exile could never truly forget you, which meant the game was never over. What happens when the ghost you tried to bury walks back into your throne room? Years had passed since her exile. The court had changed. Faces had changed. Even the queen had changed. But when the doors swung open and she stepped inside, every old fear returned in an instant. The king's hand froze on the arm of his throne. He didn't speak her name, not because he didn't remember it, but because saying it out loud would make her real again. Why was she here? No one knew. She had no title, No invitation, no reason to stand before the king. And yet, there she was, dressed not in royal silks but in a gown of deep, shadowed velvet, the kind of clothing that suggested she had chosen power that didn't need a crown. Had she come for revenge? Or something worse? She bowed, but not too deeply, a bow that said she remembered etiquette but refused to bend further than necessary. And when her eyes met his, the court felt the unspoken history like a storm cloud in the hall. The king tried to speak first, tried to control the moment. "You've returned." Simple, measured, but she only smiled, because in a game of power, silence was more dangerous than any insult. She didn't come with an army. She didn't need one. She came with secrets, secrets whispered in bed years ago, secrets he'd never written down, secrets that could destroy alliances, unmake treaties, unravel the throne itself. And the worst part? He couldn't be sure which ones she still held and which ones she had already given away. Every noble in the hall watched the exchange like a duel. Who would speak first? Who would give ground? The queen sat stiff beside the throne, her knuckles white around her fan. The mistress stepped forward, stopping just short of the dais. "I came," she said softly, "because I thought you'd like to know which of your enemies are laughing at you." The words were a gift wrapped in venom. Was she warning him or taunting him? The king's jaw tightened. He could order her seized. He could have her dragged from the hall. But if she was telling the truth, if she really knew something vital, could he risk silencing her before hearing it? And wasn't that her real weapon? That he couldn't tell if she was here to help him or ruin him? She leaned closer. No one else could hear her words now. Whatever she said made his eyes widen just slightly before his face hardened again. What had she whispered? A name, a betrayal, or something from their past that no one else in the world knew. When she stepped back, the room was still. The king finally smiled, but it wasn't warmth. It was calculation, because in that moment they both understood the truth. She was no longer his mistress. She was his equal, and that made her the most dangerous woman in the room. The game wasn't over. It had just begun again. The moment she stepped into the throne room, the air changed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Laughter froze. It wasn't just that she was there, it was how she stood there. Like she'd never left. Like exile had only sharpened her edges. The king's eyes locked on her. He didn't speak, didn't blink. And for a heartbeat, the court saw something they were never supposed to see. Hesitation. Why? Why would a king, a man who could order her head removed before she took another step, hesitate? What did she have that made him pause? A letter? A confession? Something that could burn his throne to ashes? The guards saw it too. Their hands hovered over their sword hilts, waiting for the signal to strike. The signal never came. Instead, the king raised one hand and told them to stand down. The ripple of whispers was instant. This was wrong. This was dangerous. Kings didn't show mercy to uninvited ghosts from their past. And yet, here she stood unshackled, untouched, and wearing a faint glint in her eyes that made you wonder whether she'd just walked into the lion's den or whether the lion had walked into hers. The queen broke first. Her voice cut across the hall like glass on stone. "Your Majesty, this woman's presence insults the crown. Let her be removed." But the king didn't even look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the mistress. That silence, louder than any command. And then she spoke. "I thought," she said, her voice low but perfectly clear, "you'd like to know which of your allies are laughing at you." The hook sank deep. Who? Why? What had they done? The court leaned forward, as if the answer might fall from her lips at any second. She began to speak of a treaty, one of the king's proudest achievements, but her version of events was nothing like the official story. She hinted at witnesses who were bribed, clauses that had been altered after the seal was set, promises made in back rooms with no witnesses except the two of them. If it was true, the entire alliance could shatter overnight. Borders would shift, armies would march, and the king wouldn't just lose allies, he'd be the man blamed for losing them. And the proof? She had it. The king's jaw tightened. He didn't interrupt. Was he calculating? Bluffing? Wondering whether she had just loaded a pistol and aimed it at his head, or whether she was holding nothing at all? Could she be bluffing? The queen thought so, she had to think so, but the king wasn't sure. And if the king wasn't sure, then no one in the room was safe. "You've had years to forget me," she said finally. "But I haven't forgotten you." The words hit like a thrown dagger. Were they a threat? A promise? Or something worse, a reminder that the past had a way of clawing its way back to life? The king leaned back, eyes never leaving hers. He could destroy her with a word. And yet, wasn't destroying her exactly what she wanted him to try? The queen shifted sharply, her fan snapping shut with a crack that echoed in the silence. She could see the danger. The king wasn't thinking about removing this woman. He was thinking about using her, and that meant the game was already being played, one no one else could stop. The mistress turned to leave. No one blocked her path. No guard laid a hand on her. But as she passed through the doorway, every person in the room felt the same cold truth settle over them. She had come back with something that could either save his crown or destroy it. And worst of all, no one knew which one she'd choose. The doors closed with a sound like a final verdict. The throne room was gone. The crowd was gone. Now it was just him and her. No guards between them. No witnesses to soften the truth. The king stood, slow and deliberate, his crown catching the candlelight like the edge of a blade. "You've changed," he said. His tone was almost amused. Almost, she tilted her head. "So have you." But the air was different now. Without the eyes of the court, his hesitation was gone, and she could feel it the way a deer feels the wolf before it sees the teeth. He moved closer. "Tell me," he asked, voice low, "how many people know what you've brought me?" Her reply was instant. "Enough." A lie? The truth? In this room, both answers could get her killed. The king's mouth twitched into the faintest smile. "You think you've learned the game. That because you've tasted power once, you can play it twice." He circled her slowly, boots echoing on the marble. "But games are won by those who can throw away the board." "Then maybe," she said, her voice steady, "you'll find I'm not here to destroy your throne, only to sit beside it." Silence. A dangerous kind of silence. It wasn't an offer. It was a challenge. And in that moment, something shifted, not in his favor, not in hers, but in the balance between them. He stopped behind her. "You were always clever," he said. "But clever women forget one thing. Kings don't share." The sound of metal sliding was the only warning she got. Guards stepped out from a hidden panel in the wall, their armor whispering in the dim light. This was it. The end. Or the bluff. Which? She didn't flinch. "If you kill me," she said softly, "my secrets will outlive us both." He leaned close enough for her to feel the weight of his words. "Then let them," he whispered. The guards moved, hands like iron on her arms, dragging her backward. The goblet on the table tipped, spilling wine that ran across the marble in a slow red river. The hidden door behind the throne opened. The air beyond it was black. No one in the court saw her again. No one dared to ask. And yet, weeks later, in the chamber of a foreign king, a letter appeared, sealed in wax, written in a hand the crown had tried to erase. It contained a single sentence: "I am not finished."